tying on Shabbat. There's a melacha. This melacha is one of the classic 39 melachot when it comes to the construction of the Mishkan, where tying was a necessary feature of the process of the construction of the Mishkan itself. Meqoshesh etzim b'Shabbat is one classic example of this. Taking a bundle of trees, typically these things are tied up, right? Wherever you tie bundles of stalks, bundles of wheat, bundles of reeds, it's pretty much impossible to construct anything without some form of attachment or some form of tying. But there was more than one necessity for it. You also had animals, by the way. It's very difficult to slaughter animals when you have the korbanot. You have the skins they had to take from the techashim. We have the skins they took from goats, from rams. There was a lot of leather in the Mishkan. So the type of knot that you can or cannot tie on Shabbat is going to be a function of the melacha itself. Okay? Believe it or not, and this is another feature of Hilchot Shabbat that we haven't really discussed so far. We talked about permanence. We're certainly going to talk about this as well. We talked about your intention. So doing a melacha unintentionally is never going to be asur midoraita. In fact, it's hard to legislate on anything that's unintentional, but there are situations where you're held responsible for such things. The el miklat, for example. What's an el miklat? It's someone killed somebody unintentionally, but it was criminal negligence. It wasn't unintentional by accident, like I slipped and fell and hit somebody and he died. It was a criminally irresponsible behavior that ultimately got out of my control and then caused somebody to die, even though that wasn't my original intention. So when it comes to Shabbat, there's the permanence, what's called the qayama. Is it something that's meant to last, not this forever, nothing lasts forever, but long enough? Generally, the discussion ranges somewhere between 3 and 7 days when it comes to what's considered a qayama or not. In terms of writing, we said for sure, if you're writing something permanent, it's meant to be there, it needs to be erased or scratched in order to be undone. Absolutely, this is writing midoraita. Writing in a more temporary way may not necessarily qualify. So there's intention, there's doing something at the hands of a non-Jew or a child is another way of not necessarily violating something midoraita. We'll discuss this in another context. There's also the feature or the aspect of what's called professionalism. Let's say omanut, or to do something derech oman or kederech baalei omanut. Meaning, if something is generally left up to someone professional, and I do an unprofessional job of it, there is a good chance that it's going to be midorabanan and not midoraita. What does that mean? Okay, unfortunately, the classic example is tying knots. Well, you may or may not be familiar with this. You guys ever go to the Boy Scouts? They had something like this in France, Manitou.
They had the...
Ashkenazi made himself famous. You didn't go.
I escaped from it.
Nobody went. Okay, so what you would have learned if you ever did any of these Boy Scouts or survival...
You did?
No, but I don't know these things on my own. What you're going to learn is hunting animals, trapping them, and doing something with them. It's all part and parcel of the process. So what you would learn if you ever did take such a course, and they usually give you badges for different achievements, is there's a badge for knot tying. Okay? There are books. Nobody prints them anymore because nobody ties knots anymore. But there are books, very important books, used to sell for a lot of money, especially amongst, of all things, sailors. Right? Anybody who worked in the maritime industry had to find a way to keep his ship from running away on him. The tide would come in, the tide would come out, and you would have no way to get back where you're going. You would have lost your merchandise. So, sailors are really good at tying knots. And they have this, they still do teach in the Navy, by the way. This, you do have all kinds of knots. There are knots that are more permanent. There are knots that are easier to undo. Knots that are, that compromise less the strength of the string itself. Normally, when you do tie a knot, you lose about 50% of the tensile strength of the string. That's just an interesting fact. Knots aren't very healthy per se for the string itself. They serve another purpose, not for strength. So you have knots that used to be tied classically by people who drive animals. Okay, so camel drivers and cowboys always had knots, lasso, right? This is what they used to use to corral animals that were getting away from the herd to keep them under control. So the idea is like this. If you tie a permanent knot and you do it the way the professionals do it, okay, and potentially if you're a professional yourself, even something relatively simple, you would have violated the isur of tying a permanent knot on Shabbat, because here the knots that we're looking to forbid are the professional, industrial, specialist kinds of knots. So there was a knot they used to tie, for example, these are classic examples of today they do this with bulls, but they used to do this with camels. So camels, or bulls for that matter, if you want to keep good control of them, they would pierce their noses, right? The way that freaks volunteer to do this to themselves today. They would pierce their noses, the septum, and they would tie a permanent knot, which would basically make like a ring. Today they do this with metal. You ever seen the classic cartoon pictures of a bull? The bull always has a metal ring in the nose. That's what that ring is for. It's basically made so that you can pull the bull wherever you want, because it's not pleasant to have your septum pulled out. So you would attach a string to the ring that you already put there. Normally it was a piece of leather. And this way you can lead a very large and violent animal pretty much wherever you want it to go by pulling it. It becomes unpleasant not to follow. Kind of like the way the government works with taxation, but we'll leave that for another time. It hurts and you want it not to hurt, so you pay what you have to just to get them off your back. So eventually, these knots came to be recognized, and it was presumed that certain knots were known publicly to be professional kinds of knots, and if you tie this kind of a knot, you'll have violated the halachot. So the kind of knots they used to tie in the noses of camels or cattle, they're the kinds of knots that they would tie in order to dock ships to prevent them from running away. The kinds of knots that people would tie in order to keep things permanently in place, or the knots that you would tie in order to leave yourself some kind of permanent ring on the bow of a ship or in the nose of an animal, so that you could tie something else onto it, even if it was more of a temporary thing. Those are the knots that we're talking about. Practically speaking, in halachic terms, the question comes up in a few interesting ways. Number one, I don't know if you've ever actually seen this, because I have an eye for this. You ever seen people who walk around with untied shoes on Shabbat? So I always wondered why they just don't wear loafers, which is a personal philosophical issue that I'm still working on. I have anxieties about people like this. You could buy shoes that don't need to be tied, but you want everyone to know that you're so frum that you have shoes with laces and you don't tie them. In other words, it's a neurosis of a different kind. I wouldn't know how God-fearing you were if your shoes were more discreet. It would be a loss for me and for the rest of humanity not to know this. So you see people walking around with untied shoes on Shabbat. They tend to be of Lithuanian persuasion. I've never seen the Rabbi from Koshnitz, but if that happens to be the case, I may or may not be surprised.
If his shoes were untied, I would bend down just to tie them.
And he would probably get mad at you for violating Shabbat. So there you go. That's why you're not the Rabbi. So that's an interesting point. So what exactly defines a professional knot? In other words, if we have to distill some kind of a standard from the examples that we have, what makes a knot professional to the extent that you can't undo it on Shabbat? Any knot that it's a surah to tie, it's a surah to untie. That's just the way it is. The same thing with writing. If it's considered writing, you can't erase it. Anything that is a surah to write is also a surah to erase. So the way it works with knots, some of the simple definitions that we're given are tying two knots, one on top of the other. Okay? When I say knot, I meant to bring string and I forgot. I had cotton butcher twine at home. So think about the way that you tie your shoes, for example, right? What we call a double knot in English, which by the way the Boy Scouts call a square knot because that's really what it used to be called. So you take two pieces of string, you wrap them one around the other, you tie it once, do the same thing twice. Okay? And that's a knot that'll probably last more or less forever. Unless you pull on it really hard, it'll probably break the string, it won't break the knot. So tying two knots, one on top of the other, is not 100% universal in terms of how we regard it. And it being forbidden on Shabbat. What's universally accepted as permissible is doing what's called, this is called a simple kesher, a simple half knot. So that would be a slip knot if you just pulled two pieces of string and you pulled them tight. Why? Because it's just the friction that holds them in place. Okay? And this you can do a number of times. When I'm tying meat, for example, because meat is kind of spongy and springy, sometimes I'll put a few extra loops in, and then when you pull it, it stays that way. You make that second knot just to keep it tight, and it doesn't give up slack when it comes back. Which, by the way, that's the meaning of the word slack. I don't know if you're familiar with this or not. In English, the meaning of the word slack is how loose a rope is. So you tell someone, pick up the slack, it means your knot stinks, make it again. Like, there's too much loose rope here, it's not going to hold anything. So when you pick up the slack, it means that you tie it really tight, there's no loose rope left. So tying a knot, okay, a simple over and under kind of knot. And then folding the thing the way that everybody ties their shoes. I'm going to assume for the purposes of this conversation that everybody here knows how to tie their shoes, that there's some kind of universal standard as to how it's done so that you can pull one string out and everything pops out. Maybe you don't know and that's okay, now's not the time to discuss it. Keep it to yourself and we'll hammer it out some other time. So the way that that knot works is that this is what's called in Hebrew kesher va'aniva. Aniva is the modern Hebrew word for a tie, right? A tie, like a kravat. So ironically, the way that we tie ties today, a Windsor knot anyway, seems much more suspect. Which is why you'll find many people, more often than not of Lithuanian persuasion, who don't wear ties on Shabbat. Not a function of how much money they get from the kollel, or how much money their wives make in accounting or in computer programming or graphic design. It's a function of not wanting to make a permanent knot even on your neck, where you don't plan to keep it there for very long. Right? So
or they leave the tie like almost open and they just do this.
they leave it loose, right?
And then, so it's done before Shabbat and they just close it on Shabbat and then open it back.
It's possible to do it this way. The Windsor knot doesn't work that way. I should show you a Windsor knot. I mean, I can. If you don't mind. Huh?
You want me to take it off?
Just for the purpose of demonstration. Sure, it'd be very helpful. I'll make a double knot and then I'll ruin the silk.
It's almost as hands-on as the time you brought along.
Yes.
Oh, what?
Yeah,
Right.
This is
This is
chic.
It's
Yeah.
the pulmonary equivalent
To blow it,
of,
you show how it is glad and safe and all those things.
yeah.
It blows up, right?
Right. Okay. So here, just for the purposes of demonstration, this isn't my tie, so I don't care what happens to it. So when I say kesher, what Chazal are referring to is this. Okay, you make an X, you put this thing under, and now what you have is only friction that holds it together. Okay. No matter how many times you do this, so if I do it again, I'm going to end up with something that only holds very temporarily, and it can be undone by pulling it. Okay? To make a double knot out of this, you're going to have to get this clean afterwards, Dave. To make a double knot after this would be going like this once and doing the same thing twice. Okay? Now what I've got is a knot that's going to stay there if I pull it really tight until someone actually cuts it or cuts the string. It's a pain. Nobody ties a knot like this intending to untie it. And that's an important distinction. We're going to talk about that in a second. Okay? When we do what's called kesher va'aniva, which is the way that most civilized cultures tie their shoes today, you'll have to ask the Arabs how they do it. We go like this. Okay? You make a simple, basically the beginnings of a square knot, and then you do the same thing except with loops. Okay? In terms of string theory. The way that this works is that you're doing the same thing that you could do with open ends. If you were to tie it with open ends, you would never be able to take it out. You do it this way, okay, and you leave yourself a way to just pop it out by pulling on one thing over here, undoing the loop, and then it all pops out. Okay? Almost everyone agrees that you can tie shoes on Shabbat, save for the Lithuanians and apparently some pseudo-Kabbalists and people who try to be strict. I have seen people like this with my own eyes. I thought it was interesting. So, because this is a knot that, first of all, isn't especially professional in nature, and second of all, doesn't require all that much effort to undo, and third of all, happens to be tied without the intention of keeping it on permanently, this is the kind of knot that is permissible to tie on Shabbat, because we'll have to see there's a little bit of a number of factors you've taken into the equation. Number one, what you meant when you tied the knot. Okay? It could well be, and Rabbi Yosef makes allowance for this, that even if I tied a double knot, but I only intended for this to last throughout the Shabbat, that I could do such a thing, and then I could cut it Motzei Shabbat. Alright? The amount of time we expect something to last, we said there's an opinion that holds 7 days and opinions that hold 3 days. But there's also this additional consideration of how long did I mean for it to last. Like if I only tied it because I only need it for the Shabbat itself, then there may be room to permit doing such a thing, even if it's going to be cut right after Shabbat, or on the ground, on the condition it's going to be cut right after Shabbat. In other words, that would save me from transgression if I tied such a knot, or even if I did it by accident, just to basically undo it after Shabbat, even by cutting and destroying the string without necessarily taking the knot out. Right? Kesher va'aniva, when we do basically like you are when you're tying shoes, the question would be, how permanent do you require such a thing to be? If, for example, and it's a funny example, but the way that you tie your tie is actually the way Lithuanians would do it, okay? So, if I take the tie, and I basically make a bit of a loop, I pull this up, and I pull it back down this way, very pretty, but I'm used to doing this on my own neck. So as long as I've created something that I can slip up and slip down, this kind of knot, they'll tell you go ahead, tie it before Shabbat, and when you put it on, you can pull it over your head and basically zip it up, kind of like a clip-on tie. And as soon as you're done with it, instead of untying it, you can just slide it down. The advice some of them will give you. To tie a more complicated knot on Shabbat, you're going to have to rely on the opinion that how long you meant for the knot to last is actually going to be a deciding factor. So if I tie a Windsor knot, okay, they're a little bit more complicated. I don't know if you've ever seen this. Do they don't teach this in fashion school? You don't
This is like second grade in Italy.
I would expect it. I'm also surprised that you tie your knots this way, because the old school Hebrew are very adamant about tying the Windsor knot. So what's the idea behind a Windsor knot? The theory behind it, anyway, is that it's a knot that's even on both ends. Normally, when you tie the simple knot, it always leans one way, just because of the way that you wrap it around.
Right.
So the Windsor knot is the only solution to that. The problem is the Windsor knot is more or less a
very
permanent,
strong.
It's a permanent kind of thing. Yeah, you'd have to be intending to take it out. Look, so you go around and up.
Now you're doing just the same thing as the basic knot, but you're doing it twice.
But you do it twice and you go the other
Yeah.
way. Exactly. That's the point. And then you go around like this, and now what you're going to end up with, okay, is a knot that's going to be even on both sides. Right? If I tie it tight, you would see
this
that.
you
Perfectly even on both sides.
So this you couldn't untie on Shabbat.
So to do this, well, you could untie it on Shabbat. It becomes a different question, because none of these are. It'd have to be tensioned this way in order for. But that's how it would go.
Yeah, it works better when you do it on yourself.
We need a little bit of tension to keep it straight. So here the question would be as follows. Number one, how long did you intend for the knot to be tied? And here Rabbi Yosef says, really, you have grounds on which you could permit such a thing, even if it's a more involved knot than just a simple shoestring kind of knot. Why? Because you tied it with the intent of taking the tie off by the time Shabbat was over. I mean, it's certainly not meant to last 3 days, let alone 7. So I put it on. It's a complicated knot, but at the same time, it's a knot that I never meant should last very long. And I put it on knowing that it was going to come off, because I wasn't going to sleep with this thing on Motzei Shabbat. So according to that, it's perfectly fine for me to tie this and to take it off after Shabbat.
You have to take it off after Shabbat? You have to untie it after?
Do you know anybody who sleeps with a tie on after Shabbat?
No, but I take it off when I get home from shul.
It's not like a right away automatic.
So I can take it off. It doesn't have to be after Shabbat.
Sometime after Shabbat. Look, it's not going to be 3 days, so you'd be
Just
within
don't
your.
wear a
No,
tie
but
on
I'm-
Shabbat, easy.
No, but I'm saying
Be
I
the
untie
way-
it. Can I untie it after I get home on Shahrit from Shahrit? Can I
On
untie
Shabbat?
it untie it on Shabbat during the day?
If it were a surah to untie on Shabbat, it would be a surah to tie it to.
Right.
Okay?
Okay.
So the Lithuanian tendency is to say, wait a second, I don't want you tying knots like this, I want you untying knots like this. And in the event that you accidentally tied one, don't take it off until after Shabbat. But after Shabbat, be careful to take it off, because if it
Okay.
lasts that way for 3 days, you might have violated some kind of.
I never accidentally made a Windsor knot.
No, they're pretty involved. they're pretty involved.
So is it lechatchila or is it b'diavad if I want to do
So this becomes
my
the
usual
question.
Windsor knot on
This becomes the
Shabbat?
question. What exactly is, maybe in the nature of the knot, what makes it theoretically problematic? There are those who said very simply, 2 knots is a surah midoraita, 1 knot is a surah midorabanan. This we don't hold from, because at the end of the day, if you were to make 2 simple knots, like what we call the square knot, okay, or the double knot, they want to call it in English. So to make such a thing, it's effectively meant to stay there permanently. But to do it with loops at the end, the way you tie your shoes, yes, it's a knot on top of a knot, but it's not meant to last permanently. Even if it could, that wasn't my intention in tying it, okay? And it's not a professional knot per se, therefore it's not the end of the world.
So what about a woman hair covering? I'm just trying to be conscious because we're talking about ties for the past 20 minutes.
Right.
What about like a woman hair covering?
How would that
She
be?
She wants to like a headband, and she wants to put it in the bag and tie it twice and make it strong for it not to fall.
So that would be the question. If a knot on top of a knot is automatically problematic, so our advice would be don't tie, a simple square knot. In other words, don't make what we call a double knot, even if something that you're putting on your hair, even if you're taking off after Shabbat. Rabbi Yosef doesn't necessarily hold that way, and there's more than one way to do this. But if you can do it in such a way that you have a loop, then probably everybody but the Lithuanian community would be okay with you doing it that way. Right? There's a couple of other examples of things that are a little bit more problematic. For example, tying a knot in without closing the rope, meaning just making a simple knot at the end of it. So if, sorry Dawid, you're mutilating your tie.
It's okay, it's an Italian one.
I get them in bulk. So doing something like this, right? Because this would naturally last forever unless I were literally to untie it, there are those that wanted to say this is a problem. And there are those who went so far as to say that doing the same thing with a bag would be an issue. This is classic when it comes to changing diapers, right? Dirty diapers tend to smell. Depends on the kid what they ate, but trust me, they don't smell very good. So if you're taking a bag in order to, you want to get rid of the diaper in such a way that it shouldn't stink up the entire house, so you might be tempted to put it inside a bag and just take the two handles of the bag and then treat the whole thing like a rope
Right,
and tie
you
it
don't
up.
want air to come in.
Right, same concept.
Okay, so.
I'm talking about what's common in my circle, you're talking about what's common in yours. Okay.
Everybody struggle.
Everybody with his challenge, yeah. So yes, there'll be the same question. Would a bag be considered a straight string where even one knot would be enough to be permanent because effectively it's not going anywhere? And in terms of mitigating circumstances, you have, the fact that there's nothing really professional about it. There are those who wanted to say it takes at least 2 knots to make it a sur midoraita. And then there's the question of the permanence. So you tied up your challah on Friday before Shabbat, so it would still be fresh by the time you waited Shabbat morning. You didn't mean to keep it this way forever, right? Chances are you're perfectly within your rights to do this, just not to pull it really tight. Right? In other words, if I make a knot like this, and
Yeah, but if you want to keep it like you did Shabbat lunch, you want to keep it for after.
yeah, beseder. So instead of pulling it really, really tight, where the only way to get it off is to cut it, which, by the way, you might be within your rights to do, it's probably much easier just not to pull it all the way to the end. Meaning, if it's enough that you can undo it with one hand, chances are it wouldn't count for anything permanent and certainly not professional.
Mm-hmm.
You follow what I'm saying? If you pull it really tight and the only way to get it undone is to go ahead and pull it out somehow, either that or you just cut the thing altogether. Which is fine. If it's a bag that you don't care about on Shabbat, so you tied it, you just cut the end off and you're okay with it. That might work, according to the opinion that holds, that it's just a function of the degree of permanence that you had in mind when you tied this thing. So for example, the diaper, I'd be happy if it lasted that way all week, at least until it gets out of my house. I mean, and obviously I empty out the garbage too.
It's like a trash bag. When you have the little ropes, you tie them once, usually twice, but
the
let's
ropes
say
are
Shabbat, I do it
easier.
once.
The ropes are easier because on Shabbat I tie those things right tie my shoes.
Yeah.
If you have the red strings,
It's 2 loops.
Okay.
it's
but-
two exactly. It's 2 ends of a
Two
string,
loops,
so
so
I
it's
can
not
tie
the
it
same thing.
one, and then I can do the second one in a loop. As
Okay,
long as it
but
lasts that way until it gets out of my house, I'm happy.
I'm never gonna take it off. The knot.
Correct. And so
I'm gonna take it and put it in the trash right after Shabbat, or if I can, even on Shabbat. But that's another story.
maybe we can be a little bit more creative, and we can presume that it's going to come undone as soon as it hits the dumpster anyway. Meaning, I'm not like
Maybe
that. It's
more
not
than
gonna
3
last-
days, but maybe not
The
7.
garbage truck is going to crush it. It's going to pop in it. I don't know.
Okay.
Your goal when you do this is just to keep it intact until it gets out of the house. The way I tie, if I were to put a diaper inside a bag and tie it this way, sure, I'd be happy if it were to last this way for as long as the diaper smells. But the reality is I don't care what happens to it until it leaves my house. And for that matter, if I don't cut the bag with a diaper in it, the garbage truck, it applies pressure, everything that goes in there pops. Maybe it's not such a big deal. What I'm saying is that my advice would be just tie it without pulling it really, really tight.
Right.
Because if you can undo it, first of all, in terms of the challah, it's not going to make a massive difference. Right? As long as it's closed at 99% of its surface, you can twist the bag a little bit, you can make it such that really no air is going to escape and very little moisture is going to be lost. But if you don't pull it really tight, it's definitely not kedarko. It's not the way that knots are classically tied. If you're going on a road trip and you want to tie it up because you want it to last you throughout the week, then you can make a serious case for it being problematic if it's more than 3 days, if it's more than 7. But that would be the functional difference. So we don't have, it's really interesting, not too many super examples of how this works. In some cases, Halakhah, for example, we're more sensitive to the material. So for example, sahita, when it comes to squeezing something like a sponge or squeezing a fruit in order to get juice out of it, it seems relatively clear to most of the poskim that this only applies to natural fabrics. In other words, if I were to take plastic, which doesn't really absorb to begin with, so you ever seen those, back in the day they used to use onion bags on Shabbat. Those are the red bags that onions come in. It's basically a plastic fabric. You've seen this done before? So people just take that, add some soap to it, and they say, look, it's not a natural fiber. any water that sticks to the outside. It doesn't get absorbed in between the fibers because it's plastic. So from that, they developed, now they sell in every store, these little plastic thingies that look like those things the girls put in the back of their hair. So the idea is that because it's made of an unnatural fiber, it shouldn't be problematic. It wouldn't be a sur min rabban. Those who want to put a handle on it too, and you can find those things also. In terms of tying a knot, the reason I mention this is because if you're tying a knot in a plastic bag that you plan on throwing away anyway, and you don't care about the integrity of the bag once you're done, you probably could make a good argument for tying a simple knot at the end of the bag if you mean to cut it the following day on Shabbat anyway. You don't need it to last for more than a day. Okay, it's not a knot on top of a knot. Rabbi Yosef says you should try. It's nice to be strict, but the point I'm making is we like to stretch it a little bit. If I take something that's disposable anyway, where I don't mean for it to last a very long time, and I don't care if it does. In fact, I'm going to cut it even if I don't undo the knot. I'm just going to destroy the whole bag and undo it. You can make a pretty legitimate case for saying my intention was never that it should last very long. I didn't need it for more than 24 hours. I didn't make it a professional knot. It wasn't a knot on top of a knot.
And you can cut it on Shabbat? Like, you know, the when you buy a bottle at the liquor store, they put it in like, it's like a nice bag and they wrap it with something. Like
Well, they put a ribbon on it.
like the ribbon, but the ribbon is really tight. Like the only way to get it off is to take a scissors.
Really?
Yeah, most of the time.
I've never, no.
Most of the
Unless
time.
it's had a double knot.
Okay,
Usually you pull one
the
in
one
and
on
it comes off.
86 is more fancy than the one on 97. So it makes it tight.
I apologize for my ignorance.
It's the 80s, Rabbi.
Right. I'm a bull in a china shop. I feel bad. Yeah.
No, but seriously, so that guy, would you be alive if you receive a bottle like that to cut it?
Oh,
to
that's a
cut-
separate question. It's never asur to cut a rope or a string on Shabbat.
It's
Well,
how you do it.
What would be asur would be to try to undo the knot and untie
That's
it
what
the
I'm
way
saying,
that someone would, as if you're trying to preserve the string or the ribbon itself.
So you'd rather
If you
take
cut it in such a way that it
scissors.
destroys it, it's not an issue. In other words, you don't have to cut the knot, you can cut next to it. So I'm not undoing the knot, I'm just cutting the string. The knot can stay there permanently forever, it'll be in the garbage. But that's not a major concern to me. It's never asur to ruin something for the purpose of getting something out of it on Shabbat, except if you take a permanent knot and you try to untie it with your...
I'm just connecting because you just said the plastic bag. If you don't really care, then it doesn't matter.
No, I was trying to make the
They also
point.
don't
So
care.
even
It's
so,
gonna
the
go to garbage.
guy who packages, who gift wraps the wine,
Yeah.
chances are he himself knows it's not going to last very long too.
True.
Right. So you could make the case that it's disposable. That even though it was technically meant to be a tight knot, it's supposed to last as long as until someone actually cuts it, until someone has to make use of it. But in that case, Rabbi just says, look, it's nice to be strict if you can, and if you can't, you probably do have what to rely on. But to cut the knot, I'm not tying that knot on Shabbat. Just for me to cut that ribbon on
No
Shabbat,
problem.
not an issue. That's
Even
not
if
an
you.
issue.
Okay.
Yeah, usually I'll give it a little bit of a tug. I mean, my experience with them, at least everybody in the 90s and up, I guess it's a budgetary thing. They can't afford that extra loop that makes it impossible to open. So they, we started on budget, so we have. Right. So this is the long and short of the discussion when it comes to diapers. The sensitivity would be that if I'm tying a bag with a diaper in it because I don't want it to smell, I probably do want some degree of permanence to it. In other words, as far as I'm concerned, if I didn't take the garbage out over 2 or 3 days, I still wouldn't want it to smell. At least not in my house. Even though it's a plastic bag, even though it's going to get destroyed once it reaches the garbage anyway, it's good to be mahmir. But at the end of the day, if you tie it in an unprofessional way, and by the way, the same thing that you do with your shoes, you can do here too. Instead of tying just a simple knot like this and pulling it really tight until the thing doesn't move, I can also do that by folding it. So if I do the same thing but I do it this way, I've effectively created the same kind of knot that I put on my shoes.
Yeah.
So this you can tie as tight as you want, because you can undo it with one tug.
So what about how I have to do my kids not this
I
way?
can redo that, by the way, in case somebody didn't
I-
see that. But it's a very useful. In Israel, everybody uses plastic bags for everything, and they're super helpful. Like we don't buy garbage bags in the bathroom and all that. So if you were to take a rope or a string, you just make a simple knot like this, and you tug it really tight. There are opinions that hold that it's a sur because it would never come out on its own, and we have questions about permanence. So all you have to do is just fold the one end. Make a knot like you do when you're tying your shoes. This is a silk tie, but I'm going to pull it really hard in order to make a crease in it.
Pretty sure I'm tying my shoes wrong.
So here, just like that. Okay, I can tug on this as hard as I want. At the end of the day, I just pull, and the thing pops out. If I pull a little bit harder, I'm going to pop some of the stitches. But
So
but
the
that's
way I, for example, my kid, if I tie his shoes the normal way, in about 4 to 6 seconds, they're going to be untied. That
Right.
makes. I'm sure you had the same
Would do
experience.
something like
So what I do is,
Force acceptance is generous.
sorry.
We just use Velcro. No sense using knots for kids.
So that's what he has for school, but for Shabbat we have like fancy. So
Yeah, fancy. So he was walking around with open shoestrings and it falls.
no,
Then
no,
he has to get stitches on Shabbat. Ask me how I know.
No, he's from.
no. So the way I usually tend to do it is I do a normal knot,
Mhm.
and then I take all the two loops and the two things that are on the side, and I make another knot with it.
Mhm.
And this way it lasts about 2 to 3 hours times to go to shul. How permanent? So if I leave it this way, it's going to stay forever.
Correct. That's the argument that.
And I don't necessarily have the reflex
the
to
more
untie
Lithuanian
it
crowd
after
makes,
Shabbat. So I
No,
should
so
untie
just
it
so-
after Shabbat.
So equip yourself with Mekorot. The Mishnah Berurah is perfectly okay with a Kesher V'Aniba. He's fine with tying shoes. He mentions his opinion that's strict, and there are people who
Even if I
intentionally
tie
do
my
that.
shoes not in the usual way because I have to tie them in a tougher way for the kid, for example.
Meaning you just tie it tighter. You tie it tighter because
Like I do another knot on top of it.
To make an extra knot on top of it
Yeah.
might be, in theory, a little bit more problematic. Maybe yes, maybe no. First of all, that knot never lasts very long anyway.
It lasts 3 hours.
According to the opinion, no. So this is what we call a double knot in English. Basically, it's the simple knot. Really going to destroy this thing.
So the way I can show you how I do
No,
it.
so it's a simple knot, and then you make another, what we call the aniva,
Yeah.
and then you make another one on top of that.
Exactly.
So this, probably if you can avoid doing it, it's a good idea. Based on the simple opinion that two knots on top of each other are problematic, that second knot probably doesn't count, the third one might though. In other words, the first and the third one might be the ones that are problematic. The second one's
Okay.
called an aniva because you can tug it out with one finger.
I got it.
And basically it's easy to undo. The third knot, it's really not going to last very long because it's not going to have the same tension to it that the first one
No,
does.
it doesn't.
But then, in other words, what you're relying on, which is probably fine at the end of the day, is the fact that you don't mean for it to have any degree of permanence, and you know for a fact it's not going to last very long to begin with. So technically what you have there is a knot, a slip, and another knot.
So with the Avidan, it kind of works.
It works b'diavad, and you know, empirical data corroborate the fact
Yeah.
that nothing you tie in a child's shoe is going to stay there very long. But it's probably better to avoid it if you can, just in order to incorporate that extra level of humrah where, you know what, we'd rather not make too many knots in succession because there's an opinion that holds that's all it is, just a function of that. Basically, no one holds that if you're tying two ends of a string like this, it's going to last ever for anything. So all the permanent knots have some kind of a combination of two knots to them just to keep it permanent and keep it fixed. Yeah, look it up if you ever get really bored. Look up. There's a knot.
I wish.
There's a knot called the Turk's head knot. They have all sorts of really interesting sailing knots, where basically the less direct the knot is, the stronger the rope is going to stay. You can make a knot that actually has a little bit of give to it, that the ship doesn't just, and if there's a storm, break the string and take off. So there's a lot of useful and creative ways you can do this. At any rate, those are the major applications of it. The question is asked also about things like tying knots on the bows behind little girls' dresses, because every little girl's Shabbat dress has some kind of a bow or a string behind it. Baruch Hashem, that my own experience has taught me that those things are nowhere near any more permanent than the knots that you tie on the boys' shoes. The only difference is that if you do tie a double knot, that might stay there forever. In other words, you could accidentally tie it so tight that it just wouldn't come off afterwards. So, I mean, you could take it off, but the knot would stay. So we would still recommend not doing that.
So you do a
Make it
simple bow,
whether you
right?
would tie a simple bow knot, whether you would tie on shoes, that would work. But anything else that you do with animals or anything more complicated, if for whatever reason you have to tie something up that it shouldn't run away from you on Shabbat, then it would have to be in a more temporary way. Actually, tying for animals is a little bit more complicated because it's a classic example of the professional knots they used to tie so animals wouldn't get away. So if it's a professional, sophisticated knot that would never be undone, you're right back in problematic territory. That's not going to help you. Yeah.
I probably missed this, but what happens when you need to tie two knots on your shoes once the shoelace will come down? Besides tying with your left hand.
So when you say two knots, you mean, feel free to use Dawid's tie because we already...
Shoelaces and the one knot will come undone, so you need to do.
So,
It's a certain type of
but when we
laces.
say knot, this is the important
It's a
thing.
regular bow, regular shoelace knot.
Okay, so your regular shoelace knot, you're tying like this.
So I don't tie my knot like that, Rabbi.
You're from
And I think
California.
that
I gotta hear
think
this.
that
Neither do I,
she-
Avidan, but
think
that's
that
another
she's
story.
referring to the way that I tie, which is just you tie it and then you just tie it like a square knot, like what you were saying.
No, I'm referring to that.
You tie your shoes with a square knot every time you put them on.
We have to start wearing loafers.
They taught you this in rehab?
I never learned how to actually tie my shoes. It was just like,
Bro,
This is embarrassing at this point.
We could do a workshop. I mean,
I'm trying to learn right now.
you do like the kid, like the two loops and you put them together? Yeah. Okay. A lot of people do
I
that.
mean, it's a California public school system. I don't know.
Okay.
It was a budget thing. Maybe they said it in Spanish. So this is the classic. Just so everybody's
Wait,
clear.
before you go to that one, what's the answer?
So I'm still not clear on the question.
But
basically like
you
this.
do one bow knot, like
This-
the knot you did
right,
before,
this-
but that will come undone. First experience tells you you need to do a second knot on your shoes.
Right. So this is the classic bow knot. What I did before was a little bit tricky because it's a variation on the theme where instead of making two bows, you always loosen tension there. So you just take a straight, you make the bow through here, it comes out a little bit tighter. But this would be your standard shoelace knot.
Yeah.
You're saying this isn't enough?
So I have an opinion that you can do it with your left hand if you have to make a second knot.
Right. So right. There was a question that Yohan basically asked before. To make another knot on top of this one, then you're slicing and dicing the different opinions as to what makes a knot forbidden on Shabbat.
Right. Well,
So-
you know you're going to take it off after Shabbat.
Exactly. So one opinion holds it's a function of the permanence that you have in mind. In other words, if I mean for this knot only to last the kid for an hour or two, even if in theory it could stay that way forever, that would already be enough to permit you to take it off even on Shabbat. You permitted to tie it on Shabbat, permitted to untie it on Shabbat with the second knot. Then there's the opinion that holds no, it's two knots in succession automatically indicate some degree of permanence. That's the kind of thing that we try to avoid. What we permit would be a simple loop plus the bow knot on top of it. To go beyond that, even if your intention was to keep it short and it wasn't going to last forever, might be a little bit more complicated, more problematic.
Even if you try and do the other knot you showed us that you do on
I'm just saying,
Shabbat.
you would end up relying on one opinion and potentially not fulfilling the other, which is fine. Chances are it's okay. To do it with your left hand would be considered some degree of shinui. I don't know how tight you could make this doing it with your left hand, but yeah, it's interesting. I tie an awful lot of knots. Just tying ropes in general is something that you get used to. So the better way around something like that would be to just make two really tight knots, or to try to have the child tie the extra one if that's at all possible.
Two tight knots.
To make the first, like the bow part, as tight as you can,
Right.
and if the child wants to do it for his own benefit, then it's his own, like he's doing it for himself. It'd be a classic example of a Halakhah that it's permissible for a child to do for himself on Shabbat. If I were to tell him, look, this is, first of all, because there are people who hold that it's permissible anyway. Second of all, because we'll talk as soon as class is over. We'll talk. I promise. I'll dedicate time.
It's a good idea for chinuch. I can teach you how to tie a knot.
But yeah, so
I get a bad mind.
he's doing it for his own benefit. He could not do it and it would still be fine. What he's doing is perhaps even permissible, midrabanan, and certainly midoraita. So it's probably not a bad route to go if the child's of age that he can actually tie such a thing of his own. Might it be a bad plan? But what's universally acceptable is the bow knot. Up until that point, just about everybody except for some Lithuanians hold that it's fine. You'd be in good shape. No, we're a little bit long with the the budgetary discussion before our show, so maybe we'll save the masal for next week. But at any rate, yeah, if anybody has any particular questions or anything else that you'd like to bring up, you're more than welcome to. One last note, it's really interesting. I haven't seen too many of them today, and I think they were phased out on purpose. I do remember though, growing up, that there were some Ashkenazi Sifrei Torah where they had what they call this garter, like a belt going around the Sefer. Today they make them mostly with a Velcro or with like these clips. And I do remember back in my day that they had some that were just simple ribbons that they would tie. Very interesting question was asked: what happens if they give you a Geilah on Shabbat, and you need to tie this Sefer Torah? So I can tie it up in such a way that it lasts forever. Normally, it would be enough that you just tie it the same way that you would tie your shoes, and then the question becomes a question of permanence. And so the Ripple scheme that wanted to say, if that same Sefer is going to be used sometime during the week, i.e., it's not going to be a 7-day ordeal, it'd be mutar to do it that way. And if not, some of them wanted to say you shouldn't. So if you're in a shul that only has one Sefer Torah, they're going to be reading the same Sefer that you roll up on Shabbat morning. You're going to be reading from Mincha in the afternoon, and then Sheni and Chamishi, so on Monday and Thursday. So at least by the time Monday comes around, it hasn't been 3 whole days that the knot was there. So my intention in tying it, both, I tied one permanent half and one temporary half. In other words, it wasn't a professional super duper tie, super duper knot. Second of all, even when I tied it, my intention wasn't that it should last for longer than 3 days, because we said there are different opinions. Some hold by 3, some hold by 7. So if the purpose of reading Sefer Torah on Shabbat, Monday and Thursday is that we shouldn't go 3 days without hearing the Torah, so we're hearing the Torah read from the parchment. So there I gain both the somewhat temporary nature of the knot, even though it's one on top of the other, and also my kavanah, my intention in tying such a knot was never that it should last more than 3 days. So even if that sefer wasn't used in the rotation, for whatever reason, somebody has a yard site and wanted to use the sefer they donated in the name of whatever, grandfather, grandmother, etc. So at least when I tied it, that's what I had in mind. I was told they're going to be reading from it on Sheni and Chamishi, and so it shouldn't have been much of an issue, even if they ended up not using it. But it gets a little bit sticky, just because we have more than one opinion as far as what constitutes the permanent knot that we're not allowed to tie in Shabbat. Very good. All right, with God's help, we will see you guys next week. And